The shadow that outlived the fox approximately equals 1,000 words. They feared him even after he was gone. Not the man himself, not his boots on the sand or his binoculars raised toward the horizon, but the idea of him. A shadow that stretched across maps, across radios, across the minds of German generals who knew something the world did not yet understand. Erwin Rommel was dead by October 1944. But on the Western Front, German commanders still fought as if he might return at any moment, and the Americans knew it. Before this story truly begins, do one thing: stay with it. Because what you're about to hear is not about Rommel's victories, or Patton's tanks, or the usual World War II legends. This is the story of how the United States learned to weaponize a ghost, and how German generals broke under the weight of a shadow they could not escape. In late 1943, deep inside a converted schoolhouse in Norfolk, Virginia, a small group of U.S. Army officers gathered around a wall-sized map of Europe. The room smelled of chalk, cigarette smoke, and damp wool coats. There were no reporters, no flags, no speeches, only silence. On the map, the Atlantic coast of Europe was marked in red grease pencil. Normandy, Pas-de-Calais, Brittany. Each defensive line carried notes copied from captured German documents and written again and again, in different handwriting, was the same name: Rommel. The officers in the room were not studying how to defeat Erwin Rommel. They were studying how German generals thought like him, and how deeply they feared being judged by him. One of the men present was Colonel Thomas Weaver, a logistics officer by rank, but an analyst by instinct. He had spent months reading intercepted German communications, not battle orders but arguments, letters, complaints, private assessments passed between generals who no longer trusted Berlin. Weaver noticed something strange whenever a German general discussed coastal defenses, delay tactics, or elastic retreat. Rommel's name appeared sometimes respectfully, sometimes bitterly. He would never allow this. One message said, "Rommel warned us," said another. If the Führer had listened to Rommel, Rommel was no longer alive, but he was still commanding them, and that terrified them. Across the Atlantic, American planners realized something critical. German generals were not unified. They were haunted, torn between Hitler's rigid orders and Rommel's aggressive, flexible doctrine of defense in depth and rapid counterattack. Rommel had believed in meeting the enemy at the water's edge. He had pushed for obstacles, mines, immediate response. Others wanted mobile reserves inland. Hitler wanted neither discussion nor retreat. The result was paralysis. And the United States saw an opportunity. In early 1944, a classified directive circulated to select U.S. commands. It never mentioned Rommel by name. It didn't have to. The language was subtle, almost surgical. Exploit doctrinal hesitation. Force premature responses. Create the illusion of immediate assault. This was not brute force. This was psychological warfare, American style. When U.S. bombers struck rail lines in northern France, they did it unevenly, not everywhere, just enough to suggest Rommel's coastal-first strategy was correct. When fake radio traffic increased near Calais, it echoed Rommel's warnings about that exact sector. German generals argued with each other over ghosts. Some demanded immediate reinforcement of the beaches. Others insisted Rommel was wrong, that the real invasion would come later, inland. Each decision felt like a referendum on Rommel's legacy, and no one wanted to be the man who ignored the desert fox and paid for it. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, American soldiers trained relentlessly. But something was different from previous wars. Officers spoke less about heroics and more about tempo, speed, confusion, keeping the enemy reacting. One infantry captain wrote in his journal, "We're not trying to outfight them. We're trying to never let them think straight." On June 6, 1944, when the invasion finally came, German generals did not respond as a single force. They hesitated. Some waited for confirmation Rommel would have demanded action, they thought. Others delayed, fearing a feint Rommel would expect deception. The shadow split them in half. By the time panzer divisions were released, the moment Rommel had always feared had already passed. But this story is not about D-Day alone, because even after Normandy fell, even after Paris was liberated, even after Rommel's name faded from headlines, German generals continued to fight an enemy who wasn't there. Every rapid American advance felt to Rommel like. Every sudden pause felt like a trap he would have set. They began seeing him everywhere, and in the forests of France, the fields of Belgium, and later the frozen roads toward Germany itself. The United States learned how to keep that shadow alive using speed, deception, and relentless pressure, not to honor Rommel, but to break those who still feared him. And soon, one American general would step forward, one who understood momentum better than any man alive, and turn Rommel's shadow into a weapon sharper than steel. That is where part 2 begins. When America learned to move faster than fear. 1,000 words by August 1944. Something unnatural was happening on the Western Front. German generals were no longer reacting to what American forces were doing. They were reacting to what they believed Rommel would have done. And that difference was fatal. After the breakout from Normandy, U.S. armored columns didn't advance like traditional armies. They didn't secure every flank. They didn't pause to dress lines or wait for perfect coordination. They moved forward in long, aggressive thrusts, punching through gaps before German command could even agree on whether those gaps were real. To American soldiers, it felt reckless. To German generals, it felt terrifyingly familiar. Rommel had always believed speed created truth on the battlefield. Move fast enough, and the enemy would assume you knew something they didn't. Now, American units were doing exactly that, sometimes intentionally, sometimes instinctively. Inside a stone chateau near Brussels, General Heinrich Eberbach studied reports coming in from multiple corps. Each contradicted the last. American armor spotted here, infantry advancing there. Then silence, then suddenly, another breakthrough miles away. Eberbach slammed his fist against the table. This is Rommel's chaos, he said. They are forcing us to decide without information. But Rommel was gone, and the men now commanding Germany's defenses were not him. The Americans understood this weakness better than anyone expected. At the heart of it was a quiet doctrine shift that never made headlines. U.S. commanders stopped thinking in terms of front lines and began thinking in terms of pressure zones. If German commanders were forced to respond everywhere, they would respond nowhere effectively. Supply trucks were pushed forward aggressively, sometimes dangerously. So junior officers were given more authority than doctrine traditionally allowed. Decisions that once required division approval were now made at battalion level. This wasn't chaos. It was controlled unpredictability, and it struck directly at the fear German generals carried, the fear of being outmaneuvered. The way Rommel had outmaneuvered others, every American feint looked like a potential decisive blow. Every pause looked like a bait. In September 1944, intercepted German communications revealed something alarming. Commanders were requesting permission not just to move troops but to retreat preemptively. Even when no American attack had yet materialized, they were retreating from the idea of Rommel. Meanwhile, American soldiers noticed something strange. On the ground, resistance would suddenly collapse in areas that should have been heavily defended. Then, unexpectedly, counterattacks would come hours too late, striking empty positions. One U.S. sergeant later said, "It was like they were always fighting the war from yesterday." That lag, the delay between perception and reality, was the shadow at work. In early October, as Allied forces pushed toward the German border, American intelligence officers pieced together a disturbing but powerful insight. German generals were no longer trusting their own reconnaissance. They trusted doctrine, and doctrine, in their minds, still carried Rommel's fingerprint. So the Americans leaned into it. False build-up signals were intensified near likely Rommel-style defensive points. Engineers exaggerated obstacle construction in places Rommel would have prioritized. Air reconnaissance was allowed to be seen on purpose. German command interpreted these signals as confirmation of their worst fears, and they misallocated everything. By the time American forces reached the outskirts of Aachen, the psychological fracture inside German leadership was complete. Orders from Berlin contradicted field assessments. Corps commanders delayed action, waiting for clarity that never came. Rommel had once warned that hesitation would destroy Germany faster than enemy fire. Now, his warning was coming true without him present. But there was another layer to this story. The Americans themselves began to feel the weight of the shadow. Officers whispered about advancing too far, too fast, about outrunning supply lines, about creating a gap Rommel himself would have exploited if roles were reversed. This fear nearly stopped the advance. Until one American general refused to slow down. He didn't admire Rommel, he didn't romanticize him, he understood something simpler. Fear only works if you let it breathe. So he pressed harder. Orders went out emphasizing speed over perfection, movement over consolidation, confusion over caution. The message was clear: do not give German command time to think. If Rommel's shadow thrived on hesitation, then relentless motion would starve it. And for a brief, violent moment in the autumn of 1944, It worked brilliantly. German units began surrendering in clusters. Defensive lines collapsed without decisive battles. Entire corridors opened through what had been considered formidable resistance. But war never allows imbalance to go unpunished. Deep in the Ardennes, beyond the reach of easy supply, beyond the illusion of total control, German command prepared something desperate, something violent, something that did not care about Rommel's shadow at all. A final gamble. And when it came, it would test whether speed alone could survive shock. When the shadow struck back approximately equals 1,000 words in December 1944. The shadow changed shape. Until then, Rommel's absence had weakened German command. His doctrine haunted them, slowed them, divided them. But now, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German leadership did something unexpected. They stopped arguing with the ghost. They copied it. The plan was born in secrecy and desperation. A final offensive that rejected caution, ignored logistics, and embraced speed with reckless brutality. German generals knew they could not win a long war. Fuel was scarce, air superiority was gone. But they remembered something Rommel had once proven in North Africa. Shock could replace strength. If they could move fast enough, confusion would do the rest. On the morning of December 16, 1944, fog settled thick over the Ardennes. American sentries strained their ears but heard nothing. No engines, no aircraft, no warning. Then the artillery began. It wasn't precise, it wasn't elegant, it was overwhelming. Shells tore through thin American lines held by inexperienced units rotated in. For rest, telephone wires snapped, command posts went silent. Entire companies vanished into the snow. For the first time in months, German forces were not reacting, they were dictating. American commanders were stunned not by the scale of the attack, but by its character. This was not the rigid, defensive Germany they had grown used to. This was movement without permission, armor pushing through gaps without waiting, units bypassing resistance instead of eliminating it. It felt uncomfortably familiar. One American colonel muttered, "This is what we've been doing to them." The shadow had learned. German generals, freed from fear of Rommel's judgment by sheer necessity, executed a plan that bore his fingerprints everywhere. Speed, deception, narrow thrusts aimed at command paralysis rather than territorial control. For a brief moment, it worked. American lines bent, then broke. Maps became obsolete within hours. Units fought isolated, unsure if help was coming or if it even existed. And yet, something was different. Rommel's shadow could inspire aggression, but it could not fix reality. German fuel trucks lagged behind advancing armor, roads clogged with damaged vehicles. Infantry, exhausted and underfed, struggled to keep pace. Orders issued at dawn were irrelevant by noon. The United States absorbed the shock not through brilliance, but through resilience. American junior officers acted without waiting for instructions. Supply units rerouted instinctively. Engineers blew bridges on their own authority. Infantry units dug in wherever they stood and refused to move. The shadow created chaos. American command adapted to it. Inside a cold farmhouse converted into a headquarters. An American general studied reports marked with question marks and crossed out coordinates. The situation was unclear, the pressure immense. But he recognized something the German generals did not. Rommel's style demanded momentum. If momentum slowed, the illusion collapsed. So the Americans made one decision clear. Hold everywhere. Not retreat, not advance recklessly. Hold long enough to drain speed. As days passed, German thrusts slowed. Fuel shortages forced tanks to halt in open fields. American artillery found range. Air power returned as the weather cleared, turning German columns into burning wreckage along narrow roads. The shadow began to fracture again. German generals argued this time not about Rommel's doctrine, but about why it no longer worked. Some blamed timing, others blamed interference from Berlin. None admitted the truth. Rommel had succeeded when speed was matched with supply and freedom. This offensive had speed but no endurance. By Christmas, the initiative was gone. American forces pushed back methodically, not with panic, but with precision learned from months of moving faster than fear. Units that had been nearly surrounded days earlier now advanced through wrecked German positions. The shadow retreated with them. Captured German officers spoke openly during interrogation. One admitted, "We thought if we acted like Rommel, we could escape defeat." Another said quietly, "But Rommel always knew when to stop." That was the difference. The ghost could inspire boldness but not judgment. As January 1945 began, the Ardennes offensive collapsed entirely. What remained of German mobile reserves was shattered. The last opportunity to change the war's direction vanished into the snow, and something else disappeared with it. German generals stopped speaking Rommel's name. The shadow that had once dominated their thinking had finally lost its power, not because it was defeated, but because it had been exposed. The Americans had survived speed with discipline, shock with adaptation, fear with movement. And now, with the road to Germany open once more, the United States prepared for the final phase of the war. Not against a myth, but against a broken command system that no longer believed in anything at all. That reckoning when shadows fade and reality closes in is where part 4 begins.